全都shari，今日は来家和你讲话，新年快乐，Happy New Year. So my portion of the talk is going to be a little bit more informal. Dr. Kwan gave you his personal reasons why he's committed to interreligious education. And he spoke generally about what my school, our school, Claremont School of Theology, is doing. And so what I wanted to do is give you a richer picture of what that looks like among the faculty and in some of the classes that I teach. Okay, so I want to say something about the institution and its commitment, because the fact that we are a faculty teaching religion, but we ourselves, the professors, have different religious commitments, that itself is not new. There are many faculties like that. So I want to say what exactly, how Claremont approaches the question of religious commitment among faculty themselves. Okay, I want to talk about that. I want to say something about faculty relationships and how we work together, how we research together, how we design curriculum together in light of our shared religious commitments and our different religious commitments. And then again, as a teacher, I'm the ethicist on campus. I teach Christian ethics. And so I want to share some perspectives from my classrooms. I've been teaching there since 2009. And I want to share with you some reflections on what difference it has made to have students who are Christian, students who are not Christian of various ways, and students who have zero religious beliefs, but are at Claremont School of Theology for whatever reason getting their degrees. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. Okay. So as an institution, as an educational institution, there are two major ways you can approach the question of what are you going to do about faculty who have their religious commitments, right? A common way that you probably are familiar with, let's say you went to, you attend a public school like UCLA or UC Berkeley, or you attend a private school like USC that may have had religious roots but have more or less become secular, is to do something called a religious studies model, which is to say the institution itself is not going to be propagating, it's not going to be trying to advance one particular religious tradition, right? It's going to be neutral. And so I used to work at a Virginia Tech. It was my first job from 2003 to 2009. And that is how I operated. So we taught religion, but not for the purpose of trying to persuade people to become, like let's say I'm a Christian, I'm trying to persuade people to become Christian. No, that's not what we're doing. We're teaching about religion. What that means, practically speaking, as a faculty member, if you want to get tenure, if you want to get promoted, it means that you have to shape your research agenda in ways that the secular academy can understand. So that means I couldn't publish a book with a denominational press or publisher. I couldn't publish with Fortress or Augsburg or Westminster John Knox Press. Why? Because these are publishing houses connected to churches. You need to be publishing with what's called university presses affiliated with institutions. It means that in the classroom, again, I'll give you the example of my colleague, my senior colleague who was a New Testament professor. When she's teaching New Testament at a state university like Virginia Tech, you are not trying to say the gospel points to the truth, right? Or here is a record of what Jesus really taught, right? You're trying to teach about the Bible as a text that, of course, has been sacred for Christians, but you're trying to teach them criticism. You're trying to say what Historians can verify. You're trying to teach them different genres. It's this type of approach, right? So it's this notion of neutrality. So the other model, so there are two major choices, is something that I'll just call religious particularity, where the institution says, we have a certain religious mission. We have a certain religious identity. Let's say you are a Jesuit school, and so therefore you're going to construct the curriculum, you're going to hire the faculty, whatever, according to that mission. Wheaton College in Illinois, Biola, you can think of all different examples of institutions that say we have a religious mission, and again, we're going to further it. So they're not trying to be neutral, they're trying to further a certain religious mission. But even here, there are two divisions, I would say. So one is when an institution has a religious mission and requires its faculty to sign some sort of statement of faith or behave in a certain way that comports with that mission. So for instance, let's say you are someone who works for a Catholic institution, and you yourself are Catholic, so you promise to be teaching theology in accordance with the official teaching of the Catholic Church. Or let's say you are working at Fuller Theological Seminary, and so you have to sign a statement of faith saying, yes, I believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, I believe in the virgin birth, I believe, Jesus is the only way, whatever. But the point is, as faculty, you say, I work with this institution, and here are my beliefs, and therefore you could potentially be fired if you publish or teach outside of those beliefs. And some of you may be aware of cases right now in this country of this type of thing happening. Another type of institution still has a certain religious mission, but does not require its faculty to say, here are my 10 beliefs. This is what I believe is orthodox, right? And so hopefully you're getting a sense. So the question is, so how does Claremont School of Theology fit into that model, right? And the answer is it's B, right? So Claremont School of Theology, as Dr. Kwan just said, is historically Methodist, will remain so, is committed to Methodist teaching, Methodist values. CST receives money from the United Methodist Church, but it is also ecumenical. So I am a Presbyterian. No one has discriminated against me because I'm not Methodist. And we also have non-Christian colleagues and colleagues with no religious belief. So as faculty, we have full religious freedom, full academic and religious freedom to believe as we do, to teach as we do, to publish as you do. Dr. A, you had mentioned something about Claremont is very liberal, right? And that is a piece of that, right? That there's full freedom for faculty to pursue the truth as they have seen it. Okay, so I just wanted to give you just a picture of what the faculty looks like. Okay, so interreligiously, what does it look like on the ground when you have colleagues of different religious commitments? How does it affect the workplace, or how does it affect the campus climate? So I'll just say a couple things about this. Number one, whether or not a faculty person is Methodist, so we've established I am not, or Christian, like we have some colleagues who are Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, and zero profess religious beliefs. We all endorse the mission. So what is the mission? Claremont School of Theology is United Methodist in origin and affiliation, and ecumenical and interreligious in spirit. Students are nurtured by scripture, tradition, experience, and reason, and are prepared for lives of ministry, leadership, and service. Graduates are prepared to become agents of transformation and healing in churches, local communities, schools, nonprofit institutions, and the world at large. So we all affirm the mission, and we understand that numerically speaking, the majority of the students probably will be Methodist, probably will be Christian, and so our non-Methodist, non-Christian faculty fully support that they are committed to helping Methodist ministers in training be the best Methodist ministers they can be, right? So first point is that we all affirm the mission. In fact, we had a hand in rewriting it since we did that, I think 5 years ago or so. So we all affirm that. Second point is to say, and this, Jeffrey had mentioned how there was some conversation maybe 2007, 2008, 2009 about really taking our interreligious commitments even more seriously than we had. And we've done so in a number of ways, and here I just want to list some. So we have discovered we have a little department called Practical Theology, Spiritual Care and Counseling. It used to be called Pastoral Care and Counseling. And to make a long story short, folks in that department recognized that the Christian tradition had a very long tradition and history of pastoral care and counseling, but that people from other religious traditions, whether they were Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim, etc., did not necessarily have that same tradition, but wanted to be trained in those ways, right? So that would be one example of the Christian tradition helping non-Christians develop these skills, tutoring, mentoring, the skills of counseling, and therefore the switch. So that would be one example. There is now a course that all Masters of Arts students must take. It's called Interreligious Dialogue in Leadership, and it's one of the most popular courses that we offer. I think there's always 60, 70 students at any one time enrolled in it, and it's usually team taught by a group of, the professors will change year to year, but it's usually team taught by professors of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish identities, right? And the goal is not just to learn about Islam, not just to learn about Christianity, not just to learn about Buddhism, but to actually get people talking with one another, forming relationships, working out common goals, and trying to work through some differences. That would be another example. One of our more popular programs is called we have a new Master of Divinity degree program for for chaplains. We're calling this the Interfaith Chaplaincy MDiv degree program. Now, why is interreligious education important? Because the way this country has set up who a chaplain is. A chaplain is someone who has what's called an ecclesiastical endorsement, a vote of confidence from his or her religious tradition. So the Lutheran Church says, yes, I vouched for you. The Catholic Church says, yes, you're okay. But chaplains, whether you're talking about the police department, a legislative body, the military, a hospital, wherever a chaplain is, he or she must work in an interreligious environment. It is not the case that one hospital will have one chaplain per each religious tradition, right? Usually there's only one or two on staff. And so even if you are a Muslim imam, you may be the person called upon to minister to a Christian patient. Or even though you're a Lutheran minister, right? You may have to be giving last rites to someone who's Buddhist. So absolutely for that reason, in order to be adequately trained as a chaplain, you need to know something about other religions, and also you need to start forming these friendships and relationships And we see the seminary context as a place where this can be done. This is a pretty, our numbers are growing, there's a lot of excitement here. Okay, so that would be another example. And then of course, Dr. Kwan had mentioned byClaremont. So Claremont School of Theology is incubating this Islamic graduate school. And the idea is that the more common model is for imams, that's the religious leader for Muslims, being trained in a different country, let's say Cairo, Egypt, or somewhere in Saudi Arabia, or a different Muslim country. But for all sorts of reasons, Muslims in the US recognize the need for Muslim religious professionals, imams, to be trained in the US context, right? Because the type of issues that Muslims are experiencing in the US are not going to be the same in a different country, right? And so byClaremont would be a good example of how we have taken seriously our interreligious commitments, right? And again, we are incubating, meaning we are we're sharing infrastructure, and the faculty, the CST faculty and the byClaremont faculty are collaborating, right, to make this happen. Okay, third point would be the faculty ethos. I want to say something about this. There is definitely mutual respect among faculty. So Jeffrey Kwan said, hey, I'm a Christian pluralist. It's not clear to me if all the Christians on faculty would say the same thing. But there is, in general, not the spirit of wanting to evangelize or proselytize, hey, my one view is better than yours. I want to underscore, though, the point here is that if there's conflict, it's not necessarily from a faculty of one religious tradition having a dispute with a faculty of another religious tradition. It's not necessarily that. In fact, the Christians, right, don't always necessarily agree, right? So I don't want to give you that sense that if there's conflict, it's that way. When we have faculty retreats or when we have faculty meetings, it's common for someone to give some sort of opening, what do we call it, convocation or opening meditation or opening prayer. And I've been on faculty since 2009. I have definitely seen, as we have really lived into this interreligious vision, those opening meditations have changed. So sometimes people offer classical Christian prayers. Sometimes people offer a moment of silence. We have one colleague who did something from traditional African Yoruba religions. I've seen the gong from what are those called? Those Tibetan meditation bowls. So I've definitely seen that type of ethos seep in through the faculty. And here I will also admit of some tension. This has been resolved, but there was a period of time when we did Dr. Kwan had mentioned how contentious faculty searches are. That is the case. There was some concern several years ago when CST was looking for an evangelism professor, because there are some faculty who felt like it would be inappropriate for CST to have a professor of evangelism if in fact we're going to be interreligious. But that has been resolved, and that faculty member is a fully respected colleague, and the person who had the grievance, is okay with it. But this is my way of saying it's not just all kumbaya, right? There are moments of conflict and tension that we have to work out. Okay, so that's something about faculty and curriculum. Now I want to say a couple things about how I've seen this play out in my personal classroom. And before I go through, I just have 5 examples. I teach 8 classes regularly, but I'm simply going to give you 5 examples from those 8 classes. And first, let me say that I was hired to teach Christian ethics. I was hired to approach theology from an ethical perspective and to teach ethics from a theological perspective, right? So I was hired to do this. Other faculty have been hired to do other things, but I was hired to do Christian ethics, and so I teach Christian ethics of different ranges, from beginning to advanced. But that doesn't mean only Christians take my classes, right? So what I want to do again is give you 5 examples of how I've seen this play out. So I teach a class maybe every 3 years or so called Animal Theology and Ethics. And this is a class where we reconsider the human, non-human animal relationship. We consider what moral obligations, if any, humans have to non-human animals. What does theology have to say? What does secular philosophy have to say? This is what we do in this class. Mostly Christians take it, but I've had through the years a number of Jewish students enroll in this class. And this has been really helpful because, for instance, as we review kosher, the dietary rules, right, in the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament, the Jews in the class who are observant can give us their lived experiences and their perspectives, right, on these dietary rules. So it's not simply we're all looking at a text. We can actually talk to people in the class who have firsthand experience with keeping this type of diet. A concern that a number of Christians have had, insofar as they think the model of anthropocentrism, the model where humans think they are the pinnacle of creation, is wrong, is how then do you account for animal sacrifice in the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible? And again, our Jewish students have done, I've seen in my classes they've offered their own perspectives on animal sacrifice that is not simply reducible to, of course, the New Testament. So for Christians, we'll interpret the Old Testament through the lens of the New, while Jewish students, again, I'm brushing very broad strokes here, have further testaments, further sacred texts that allow them to revisit these passages in the Old Testament. And Dr. Kwan, who's an Old Testament scholar, can tell you all about that, right? Okay, so that would be one example. I've had a number of Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists is what we'd call a denomination per se of, they are Christian, right? But the tying to this ecumenical vision, Seventh-day Adventists have a deep tradition of being vegetarian, primarily for health reasons. But they are also vegetarian for some animal welfare reasons. And the more I have Seventh-day Adventists share their perspectives on the topic, the more the students can realize just how particular their version of Christianity is, because there are a number of students who don't even know what is Seventh-day Adventism, right? They've just never even heard of it. So they've never had that I have them in my class, and then I have them say, well, here's my diet, and this is what our church teaches us. This serves as an education for all. Last example would be, I always have a number of non-religious students, and something that happens in my classroom, it happens almost in every classroom where I have non-religious students, is they start seeing how much of their own beliefs and practices are implicitly grounded in Christian beliefs and assumptions in ways that they did not realize, right? Because they think I'm non-religious, therefore I don't actually follow the teachings of the church, I don't really care what the Bible says. And then they start to see, when we read all these Christian theologians and philosophers, they start to see the nature of the influence, right? Who they are as people and what this tradition has said. And this has been very fruitful for everyone. So that would be one example from my animal theology and ethics class. I teach another class called Religion and Law in the U.S. This is not a theology class. This is a class where students are learning in the American context what the First Amendment says that can and cannot be done. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution offers the protection of free exercise of religion and also non-establishment, right? Students who want to be ministers need to know this because those of you who are clergy know that, or hopefully you know that, insofar as your church does not want to pay taxes, it wants to retain its 501c3 status, you cannot, during an election cycle, say, don't vote for Trump, vote for Bernie Sanders, or vote for Obama. You can't do that, right? So students need to be educated about the law. So this is why I teach this class, and we deal with all sorts of cases, right? All sorts of constitutional cases of conflict. Whenever I have Muslim students enroll in this class, they can shed light on how their communities understand certain cases. So in the literature that we discuss, there are some fears among, let's say, the general American populace, that if you create a voting district, let's say, of Muslims, then they're going to want to overthrow US law and instantiate Sharia law, right? This is the fear that, and some mainstream politicians are encouraging this type of fear. But our Muslim students are able to say, that is completely ludicrous, right? There are no US Muslims trying to make Sharia law US law, right? We have some cases, again, in US constitutional law, where there are women, Muslim women, who wear a veil, and they do not want to take off their veil for a driver's license, right? And they say there is a religious obligation for them to keep the veil on. And the government's response is, well, we need to be able to distinguish you from another person. The Muslim women at CST, not all of them veil, not all of them don't veil, right? Veiling itself is an issue that Muslim women are, trying to work on their own. And whenever we talk about these cases, it's really interesting to get the perspectives from the Muslim students on this question, right? Whether this is a religious requirement and therefore you should give an exception to Muslim women to veil or not. Finally, there are a number of cases where the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, conflicts with, let's say, a religious belief. So some of you may know that there are some traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, so Sunnah, there are some traditions of the Prophet Muhammad that suggest that dogs are unclean animals, right? So, okay. Now, there are some people with disabilities, maybe they're blind, or maybe they have some sort of heart condition, or they're prone to seizures. So they need a therapy dog, right? A guide dog to be with them. There are some legal cases of Muslim taxi cab drivers who will not allow a passenger with the disability, with the dog, to come inside. And so that becomes an ADA issue in contrast, right, with a religious belief issue. And again, it's one thing for the students to discuss it as a class. It's another thing to actually have Muslim students in the class, right, who can offer their unique perspectives on this. Okay, just another example. I have seen that when my religion and law in the US class contains the presence of non-Christian students, the Christians themselves become more sensitive to and aware of the type of privilege they have. So there's all sorts of cases about Christian crosses being put on public property, right? So San Diego's, all sorts of cases, right? Because technically, if you don't have an establishment of religion, you should not be putting a Christian cross if you're not willing to put all the other religious symbols, right? And I have seen, again, when there are non-Christian students, Christians who otherwise would say, oh, don't worry about that. That's just, that's just a symbol. They start to be more sensitive and aware of how it might be if the power relationship were reversed. Or the Pledge of Allegiance to the US Constitution. I've done some research on this, and here I'll just abbreviate for the sake of time. there are a number of Christians who see that the words, I pledge allegiance, one nation under God, right? This under God thing. That they start to see that they actually may have something in common with Jehovah's Witnesses, who don't want that, and with Buddhists, who don't want that. Why? Because it'll take a while to explain, but legally speaking, in order for the under God to be in the text, you have to actually take away any religious meaning. So under God simply means a history lesson, right? And insofar as you are an observant Christian and actually don't just want to say words just for the sake of saying, things like that, you don't want to have it in there. Okay. Third example would be my class on feminist ethics. I've had, this is a class where we ask questions about the status of women, and we talk about different ways of reasoning morally, and what is this thing called feminist ethics, and how is it different from other ways of doing ethics. My Muslim students, their very presence helps the other students see that their notion of feminism is not necessarily the same as a Muslim woman's perception of feminism. So I'll go back to the example of the veil. There are a number of people in this country where if they see a Muslim woman with a veil, they automatically think, oh, she's oppressed, she's being controlled by her dad or her husband, she's living a miserable life, right? But then you talk to Muslim women, whether or not they veil, and they say, this is not our issue, right? We may have some internal disagreements about whether we should or should not veil, but the veil itself should not be seen as a giveaway of whether we're oppressed or not. So that would be an example for Muslim students. Sorry, my Mormon students, that should say number 2. One thing to add, so we have these institutional partners that Dr. Kwan mentioned. We also have a long-standing relationship with Claremont Graduate University, CGU, and they have a Mormon studies program. So for that reason, I always have Mormons, I won't say always, but I on a regular basis have a number of Mormon students. The Mormon students tell us very interesting things, right? Because Mormonism has a different account of what Christians call the fall, right? So in the Christian picture, you had paradise in the Garden of Eden, and then you have Adam and Eve disobey God, and they are cast out, and this thus enters sin into the world. That's the Christian picture. The Mormon picture is not a fall down, but something called a fall up, or a fall to knowledge. So Eve actually plays a different role in the Mormon tradition, and that's always very interesting discussions there. Mormons also have this notion of the Heavenly Mother, and insofar as some students are interested in really reflecting on the divine feminine, they like to hear these Mormon perspectives on divine feminine. And lastly, I would say what always happens in these classes is that the Mormon women recognize that they're in a very similar place as Catholic women, because both institutions are places that do not ordain women, right? There's a glass ceiling on how high you can go. So there's lots of synergy to be had in that way. Finally, I have non-religious students, and again, they offer similar critiques. They can say, why do you think things should be this way, when they're able to expose some of the religious biases that a number of the religious students have. Okay, 2 more examples. Christian Perspectives on War and Peace. It's a self-explanatory title, right? We are looking through the different attitudes and perspectives that Christians have had about war. Should you be, a pacifist? Does the Sermon on the Mount require you to not lay down arms? What about Romans 13? Aren't all governments ordained by God, and therefore if the government calls you to fight, shouldn't you do so? These types of questions. This is what we talk about in class. And it's fantastic to have Muslim students. Why? Because there are some comparisons that can be made between Islamic jihad traditions, Jihad does not mean holy war the way Western Christians understand it. So there's really ripe comparisons that can be made. And also the Muslim students can speak personally and anecdotally and on behalf of their communities about what these various wars in the Middle East has meant for them, has meant for their communities, and how their own experiences of the war and terror have been. That's always been very, very powerful. Dr. Kwan mentioned our Muslim faculty member. This is Najiba Saeed. This is my colleague and friend. And because we have an interreligious faculty, I can very easily ask someone like her to come give guest lectures in my class. So for instance, in this class, I have a unit on something called interfaith peacemaking. This is a trend that's been happening in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. Why? Because in order to solve a problem like Israel-Palestine or Jerusalem or whatever, you're going to have interreligious cooperation, right? So with faculty, I can do that more readily. Final example is my introduction to Christian ethics. Again, Mormon students can point out to the other Christian students, whether they're Methodists or Presbyterian or Evangelicals, similarities and differences. Non-religious students, again, they can show, they themselves realize, in fact, how implicitly Christian many of them are without even realizing it. But they also can take a more critical stance to the tradition than some of the Christians are willing to do. Finally, I should add a point about conflict. So some of you, I don't know how much you're keeping up with some issues in Israel, but the Presbyterian Church USA in 2004 and again in 2014, the General Assembly, of this national church voted to selectively divest from some transnational corporations with dealings in Israel. Why? Because of the wall, the partition separating parts of Palestine. And I have taught this issue not to advocate it or not to, not to say one way or the other, but just to teach it, perhaps as an example of what some Christians have done. And this, I would say, has been complicated and enhanced by the presence of Jewish students. Because the Jewish students and colleagues, I should say, for the most part, have been very weary of any criticism of Israel, for good reason, because there is a history of Christian anti-Semitism, right? So it has been both a challenge and an enhancement. Why enhancement? Because Christians recognize that they have to tread very carefully. How can you critique, or can you critique, the modern state of Israel without yourself, stepping into a tradition of anti-Semitism? That's the type of thing that you had mentioned before. Okay, so just very quickly as a conclusion, and then I guess we can do some Q&A. I just wanted to affirm that, yes, I was hired in 2009, and that my job title and my responsibilities have not changed. So even as we've added these institutions with whom we work, these non-Christian ones, and even as the student body has changed, I still teach Christian ethics. I am still mostly teaching Christian students. But the student body has changed and continues to change. And that has meant, in some cases, that I myself have to stretch more. I have to make comparisons across religious traditions in order for students to get it, right? Especially if they don't come with that Christian background. So that's that. Okay, thank you for your time.